Here we go again. We may be in the midst of a coup renaissance of sorts, perhaps the result of a long-developing geopolitical strategy out of the Kremlin. In January of this year, it was a failed attempt in Burkina Faso, not to be confused with the failed attempt there in September 2023, or the more successful iterations there in September 2022 or January 2022. Then you have Guinea-Bissau with its failed attempt in November 2023, and another failure in Sierra Leone the same month, a success in Gabon in August, oh, hey, look at that, another failure in Sierra Leone in July, and a high-profile success in Niger a few days before. And I can't even write this video in peace without a failed attempt in the DRC in May 2024. And just so you do not think that this is a story exclusively about Africa, there were 30 arrests to preempt a coup in Kyrgyzstan in May, and you can go back to the end of 2022, when the president of Peru tried a self-coup by outlawing the Peruvian Congress, only to find Congress outlaw him. Rewind to a decade ago, and it was only possible to find a few such attempts per year. Now, it is hard to say definitively that coups are indeed on the upswing. Trends like these are noisy to detect, and you do not really know that things are on the rise until you are in the middle of an epidemic. However, it does feel like there is cause for concern. And if we understand the grand historical trajectory of coups, there is even more reason to be worried. With Russia resurgent, or at least trying to be resurgent, we may soon be marching into a new golden age of the coup. Now, I am not talking about coups generally here, but rather a specific kind. The Wagner Thunder Run proved to be quite the distraction last year, and even though the Wagner Group will play a big part in our story later, this is not where our attention is going. Indeed, rather than examining coups that could happen to any government, today's focus will be on the smaller countries, those that are the metaphorical chess pieces on the international board. In particular, we will begin with a short discussion of aid dependency among such countries, what the aid game plan looked like back during the Cold War, how the feasibility of that plan eventually fell apart, what the post-Cold War game plan looked like afterward, how that changed the overall macro trends in coups, the new game plan that Russia appears to be starting, and why that is putting the West in an awkward spot, perhaps slowly moving back to a world that looks more like yesteryear, or what we might call a neo-Cold War. We are going to be bouncing around a lot of countries in today's video, and personally, it's always a challenge to keep up. Moreover, it does not help that there is systematic underreporting of these cases within some media ecosystems. For example, while the failed coup in the DRC received broad coverage, Niger and Burkina Faso did not have the same impact in conservative media outlets. Now, I know this thanks to the returning sponsor of today's video, Ground News, my preferred news aggregation website. Remember, another of Ground News's cool features is a summary of how ideology affects the narrative of each story. With Niger, for instance, the left focused on the country's broader relations within the United States, while the right emphasized Niger's concerns about sovereignty. These summaries do not tell you what to think, but rather give you a broader perspective from which you can draw your own conclusions. That's why I am proud to partner with them again and hope you go to ground.news/linesonmaps. For the next 30 days, if you sign up using my link, you will receive 40% off their best plan, Vantage. That's what I have for unlimited access to all features. Or you can try their Pro plan for as little as 83 cents a month. Your subscription both helps this channel and supports an independent media platform. Look, I think Ground News is doing important work, so I hope you will check them out. Our main topic begins with aid dependency that underlies much of these coup dynamics. Judging by my demographics, if you are watching this, you probably live in a country that has a fair bit of wealth, a functional economy, and good government capacity, even if we all run into a turbulent period now and then. That is good because it provides a clear path for funding a government. They just tax your income. And remember, the government has enough capacity to get widespread compliance. So the money comes in, and then it goes out to fund infrastructure and public safety programs. That allows people to go make even more money, some of which they keep, and some that stays behind in the form of taxes. The cycle can begin anew, with more roads and public safety. But this experience is not universal. Not all countries are self-sufficient. Now, some governments have only done this to themselves, while others can at least point in part to extractive historical legacies from countries that are and have been self-sufficient. But regardless of how they got there, such countries rely on foreign aid to get by. Niger provides a stark example of this, at times relying on foreign aid for 80% of its operating budget. Because of how reliant these smaller countries are, the availability of foreign aid, and what it might be conditioned on, has a significant impact on their domestic politics. Notably for today, it can determine whether a coup will take place or not. Let's rewind a moment and go back to the Cold War. Comparing international politics to a game of chess is not clever or edgy. It's cliché. But it is fitting for that time period. On one side, the United States. On the other, the Soviet Union. Each side was loath to lose a political friend, as it might lead to a much larger headache down the road. Like, say, opposing nuclear weapons appearing on your doorstep. That is why both sides spent ridiculous sums of money and blood to fight wars in places like Vietnam and Afghanistan. And for leaders of smaller countries, it meant that there was a geopolitical goldmine. Recruiting friends was not free for the superpowers, but it was a price that they were willing to pay. If the United States was not forthcoming with a bag of cash, a leader could just move on to see what the Soviet Union was offering. On the surface, that sounds great for those leaders. But in fact, it was not all good news. Potential challengers also had a clear pathway to power. If a country's current leader was aligned with the United States, a potential coup plotter could simply swear allegiance to the Soviet Union, and the powers that be back at the Kremlin would be all too happy to oblige. As a result, coups were abundant during this period. But fast forward to the 1980s, and the seeds of major change were being planted. The United States was not having much trouble funding this geopolitical game. The Soviet Union, in contrast, had begun feeling the pinch as early as the 1960s. But fortunately for the Kremlin, the 70s coincided with a sharp increase in oil prices, and it just so happened that much of its inner regions were sitting on top of a vast sea of the black gold. However, the 70s gave way to a worldwide oil glut in the 80s, and the Kremlin eventually realized that maintaining the Soviet sphere was no longer feasible given its budget. But even then, the reform efforts to create a sustainable internal Soviet model eventually led to the entire Union collapsing. Russia became the designated successor in a variety of forms, including veto power on the United Nations Security Council, and as a recognized nuclear weapon state within the context of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But as one ruble became another ruble, the new Kremlin could not take over that earlier superpower position, because the Russian economy continued to deteriorate. Oh, and by the way, if you do not know the deeper story involving this 100 ruble note, you definitely want to stick around for today's outro. Trust me, you'll have a ball, maybe even two. The closest anyone has come to matching this role since then is China, through its Belt and Road Initiative. But it is still a significant step down. This post-Cold War period of US hegemony caused a massive change in coup politics. During the Cold War, the United States acquired a reputation of being willing to assist rulers with, questionable human rights records, so long as it meant that the country in question did not become a part of the Soviet bloc. But without that Moscow counterbalance around, Washington could afford to be a bit more selective. Did you just take over your country in a coup? Well, the United States is still likely to be happy to provide aid, but you had better start planning your country's next election now. Laws even came into effect that forbid giving aid to countries where coups had deposed democratic leaders. The era of blank checks was over. By and large, coups now needed to be done to advance democracy, not inhibit it. Say a military stepping in to overthrow an autocrat, rather than a military initiating a coup against any existing regime for the purposes of establishing a junta. The consequences are starkly present in the data. During the Cold War period, After a coup, elections in the following 5 years were far less common than the absence of elections. After the Cold War, the relationship flipped. It became rare for elections not to happen. You can see this mechanism more clearly by looking at aid dependence. During the Cold War, there is no noticeable difference between those dependent and those self-sufficient on whether there would be elections after a coup. Again, this is likely because either superpower was available. However, more dependence after the Cold War means higher chances of elections, now because the United States is the only game in town. Partial regression table for statistics nerds. More subtly, the change in aid flows has also altered the prevalence of coups. Look back at the difference in coups over the time periods. During the Cold War, by this measure, there were 4.74 coups per year. In the period afterward, it had dropped to a nicer 2.69 per year. And keep in mind that many more countries existed during this period than this period, so there were more opportunities for coups here than here. Now, if you think about the incentives of a coup plotter, this will start to make sense. Back during the Cold War, our mystery usurper could see two benefits. First, as a new leader, he could set the country's policies as he saw fit. Second, he could begin enjoying the personal benefits of being in charge. And remember, he had free-flowing aid to his country. Thus, there was a lot to siphon off. Combine those together, and he had a great incentive to make a play if the opportunity ever arose. But all of this changed as the Cold War came to a close. Now our mystery man faced a dilemma. If he wanted to set the policies as he saw fit, by imposing an autocracy with him at the helm, he could say goodbye to all of that sweet, sweet foreign aid. Sure, there would still be plenty of opportunities to extract wealth out of his country, but it would not be as much as those glory years, and the whole process would be a much bigger headache. Alternatively, he could accept the foreign aid and be at the mercy of a democratic election, or at least a democratic election, which would still not be much fun for him. Or maybe he was Olaf Scholz all along, so none of this applies to him. Who knows? In any case, some coups continued. But because of the pressure to run elections, there was a change in who was willing to execute a coup. If the coup plotter had a policy preference close to the median voter, and the current leader's policies were either far to the left or far to the right, a coup would sound like a good idea. By taking over, he could move the policy favorably, have no trouble obtaining aid, and stand a good chance of securing some of those benefits. However, if the existing leader was also close to the median voter, then implementing a coup would not change the policy much, and it would be hard to obtain aid. It would have to be a weird case where this guy is not running elections, despite having policies that are broadly popular. Meanwhile, an extremist trying to challenge a moderate existing leader would allow the plotter to change the policy, but it would come with burning down the country as aid vanishes. When the two are on opposite extremes, in either way, you might still get a coup, but to avoid burning down the country, he would ultimately have to concede control to someone more mainstream than him. In turn, we have fewer post-Cold War coups, but elections much more often following coups when they do happen. But today, we must begin wondering whether we are in the dawn of a new era of coups. Now, Russia is a long way away from returning to its heyday of commanding a Soviet sphere. That requires money that Moscow is currently hemorrhaging in Ukraine. Though ironically, some of the motivation there is due to the legacy of the Soviet Empire. Regardless, to make matters worse, simultaneously less money is coming in more generally due to the Western sanctions regime, and Ukraine's campaign to target the infrastructure of Russian revenue sources. But the Kremlin has pivoted to seeking more geopolitical allies in faraway lands, with a nod back to the money once again. This began as a Wagner project. At the time, the group was not officially sponsored by the Russian government, though Western intelligence essentially knew otherwise. Regardless, a political entity could hire Wagner mercenaries to provide security to the regime. In exchange, Wagner would secure a portion of the rights to some natural resource within that country. It was a way for an autocrat to stabilize control over a region, without the Western aid. The business model was very different from before, of course. Control came from foreign arms, and their presence shrunk what the regime could extract from the country itself. But when the alternative was Western aid, a democratic election, and thus eventually no autocratic control over the country, suddenly those Wagner mercenaries did not seem so bad. And indeed, Wagner appeared to proliferate everywhere, with rumors of activities in Libya, Madagascar, Sudan, along with Ukrainian special forces to chase them down, Mozambique, the Central African Republic, Mali, and Venezuela. Russia ran this program as a cheap, or even profitable way to gain geopolitical influence. As we all know, though, Wagner began cooking a little bit too much, and bit off more than it could chew with the Thunder Run on Moscow. One plane crash later, and Wagner effectively ceased to exist as an entity. But the Kremlin valued the role that Wagner provided in Africa, and subsequently took over operations, this time without the pretense of a private mercenary group. And now Niger has become the most well-known case of the new iteration of Russia's strategy, with President Mohamed Bazoum being overthrown, and Niger's flawed democracy descending into a military junta, and reaching out to Russia for military support. Not only did Moscow agree, but now Russian and American soldiers are cohabitating in this base here. That ought to be a fun one to watch play out. In the meantime, the West has a new dilemma on its hands. The post-Cold War era of unchallenged Western hegemony appears to be ending. In its place rises a neo-Cold War of sorts, with Moscow far less threatening than in decades past, but still resurgent on the global stage. Would-be coup plotters now know that they have a way to maintain power following a successful operation. And leaders of semi-democratic governments are also aware that they can take an autocratic turn if their elections' expectations are not looking so good. The dilemma in Washington, London, Paris, and elsewhere will be whether to continue democracy-contingent aid policies, or get comfortable with supporting some governments they might rather not be in business with, lest those governments turn to Russia. Of course, there is a third option, a much more concerted effort to drain Russia in Ukraine, leaving Moscow without the resources to provide meaningful aid elsewhere. But with that coming with its own set of problems, and with all sorts of resistance in Washington, the upcoming years may be full of uncomfortable dilemmas. And nothing says uncomfortable like the story behind this 100-ruble note. Buckle up, because here we go. It is standard for countries to print national architecture on their currency. The United States, for example, sure does a bunch of that. For Russia's 1997 printing of the 100-ruble note, which is roughly equivalent to the American $1 bill, the plan was to go with Moscow's Bolshoi Theater, and specifically the statue that overlooks the building. It is a depiction of Apollo, the Greek god of light, riding a chariot led by 4 horses. One slight problem. As you can observe from this angle, this dude is not wearing pants. Consequently, a campaign began to ban the bill, because children were effectively carrying around obscene material. Just imagine being a young Elvira Nabiulina, a freshly minted PhD in economics, and being told that, yes, one day you will become president of the Bank of Russia. But, monkey paw curls, this is the type of nonsense that you will have to deal with. Anyway, the campaign failed, but you will note that the 2017 design indeed dropped Apollo. Meanwhile, here is a pair of things that can be dropped into your mailbox with 2-day shipping. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.